Hey everybody, welcome to another edition of Tony T's Tune Talk, available at the Port Washington Public Library's YouTube channel. I'm your host, Tony Traguardo, and I'm ready to talk tunes. We all count on our favorite popular songwriters, bands, and performers to release songs and albums that are, well, somewhat like their other songs and albums. Sure, the music of artists like Bruce Springsteen and bands like the Beach Boys, the Beatles, The Who, matured over the years. But you could always count on some elements being consistent, like harmonies, poignant lyrics, production style, use of powerful guitar chords, orchestras, whatever. But my question is, what happens when an artist takes a surprising and unusual turn, a tangent, a side road, or maybe crosses a road divider? In this episode, I'll take a look at a few of the more interesting and the strangest turns taken by some legendary musical artists. I'll begin with one of the greatest legends of our time, Francis Albert Sinatra. Now, his strange turn happened in 1970. A little over a year before, Frank had recorded Paul Anka's My Way, which would basically become a theme for this stage in his incredible career. Frank had worked with longtime collaborator and arranger Don Costa on the My Way album, and also on that album's follow-up, which was called A Man Alone, an album composed entirely of songs written by poet Rod McEwen. Now, sales for A Man Alone were disappointing, and as the 60s ended, Frank Sinatra was looking to try something new. Now, Sinatra was really no stranger to concept albums, having arguably done one of the first ones, called In the Wee Small Hours, in 1955. But Sinatra had never worked with either singer-songwriter Jake Holmes or with Bob Gaudio of the Four Seasons. Yeah, those Four Seasons. Now, Gaudio and Holmes ended up bringing Frank Sinatra a fully written album that told the story of a man whose wife has left him and his two children in Watertown, New York, while she headed towards the big city. On the album Watertown, subtitled A Love Story, Frank Sinatra plays the part of the nameless narrator, who, in a series of soliloquies, tells his heartbreaking story of personal loss. Now, the arranger of Watertown, Charles Calello, was a rising star who, during the course of his long career, would see his name on over 100 Billboard chart records, 38 of which reached the top 20. By the way, to learn more about this fascinating gentleman, you can visit the Port Washington Public Library's YouTube page to watch the episode of Inside the Musician's Mind that I had the pleasure of hosting, where Mr. Calello was my guest. What an absolutely delightful gentleman, and so talented. But for now, back to Frank. Sinatra always recorded his vocals live with an orchestra. There's your turn. Interestingly, Watertown would be the only album in Sinatra's career where he would record his voice over pre-recorded orchestral tracks. In the end, despite the immense amount of talent involved in its creation, Watertown was released to mixed critical reviews and poor sales, with it being Sinatra's only major album release not to chart inside the top 100 on Billboard's top 200 list. But there's really true artistry to be found in Watertown, and the album has gained something of a well-deserved cult following in the 50 years since its release. I encourage any fan of Sinatra's work to approach Watertown with an open mind. While it may not encourage repeated listenings, partly because of its depressing subject matter, it's definitely worth hearing this unique entry in Frank Sinatra's vast catalog. I would, however, encourage anyone who listens online, one of the streaming services like Hoopla, Spotify, to try to find the album's liner notes, which appear on a number of websites. It's great to read along with what the writers of the piece say are happening during the songs as you hear Sinatra's performance. Todd Rundgren. an incredibly talented multi-instrumentalist, singer, songwriter, and record producer who has performed a diverse range of styles as both a solo artist and as a member of his band Utopia. Todd began his illustrious and lengthy career in the psychedelic band Nazz in 1967. And when he launched his solo career in 1970, he quickly scored a top 40 hit with We Gotta Get You a Woman. Few years later, 1972, he would single-handedly record nearly 2/3 of his double album Something Anything. That album contained Rundgren's two best-known and highest-charting singles, Hello, It's Me, and I Saw the Light. Throughout the rest of the 70s, Todd Rundgren became a highly successful, in-demand producer, and he was in charge of hit-making sessions for the likes of Hall & Oates, Badfinger, Grand Funk Railroad, XTC, and many more. After releasing a string of critically acclaimed and beautifully recorded solo albums, including 1978's Hermit of Mink Hollow and 1981's album Healing, Todd Rundgren returned to his pop music roots with 1982's The Ever-Popular Tortured Artist Effect. Great title. He also scored a major hit single with the album's novelty song Bang on the Drum All Day. Okay, so how do you follow a pop album that put you back up on the charts? You take time off and you record an experimental a cappella album. Why not? The album that he created is one of Rundgren's most unusual in that every sound is a product of the artist's voice. A cappella was created using overdubbing techniques and newly developed technology that allowed Rundgren to electronically manipulate the sound of his voice to mimic conventional rock instruments, hand claps, and other sounds. A cappella was finished in 1984 and set for release. But Todd Rundgren's label was having financial trouble at the time. And figuring that releasing an album that was experimental and not likely to sell a lot of copies was not really going to get them into the black. So the album was shelved. When the label finally did go bankrupt in 1985, its remaining master recordings were transferred to Warner Brothers Records. And at this point, fate intervenes. An early test pressing of a cappella fell into the hands of bootleggers who quickly released it. This, of course, may have strongly influenced Warner Brothers to release the album themselves in order to stop bootleggers who were now profiting from a work that was recorded by one of their artists. Despite, or possibly because of, its uniqueness, a cappella is a fascinating, beautiful, strange, and delightful album from start to finish. Songs from the album would be re-recorded and reinterpreted by artists ranging from Jennifer Warnes, Darrell Braithwaite, Matty Pryor, and guitarist Paul Gilbert, to Full House's John Stamos. I promise you, there are hooks on this album that will get stuck in your head for days. Whether you are a fan of Todd Rundgren's music or you're simply curious to hear the potential of the human voice in the hands of a gifted producer, you need to treat yourself to a cappella. Okay, we've looked at two interesting and artistically successful tangents. Now it's time to consider what can happen when an artist simply allows a series of bad decisions to almost derail his career. Elton John, the most successful solo artist of the 1970s, for sure. But by 1977, he was physically and emotionally exhausted and battling with addiction. Shortly after announcing his decision to retire from touring and live performing at the end of that year, Elton released the fantastic single Ego, co-written with his longtime hit-creating songwriting partner Bernie Taupin. Ego was the duo's first major flop since 1971. Maybe it was time for a change. Elton teamed up with lyricist Gary Osborne, and the pair had moderate success with the album A Single Man in 1978. Ironically, the album's only major hit was the instrumental Song for Guy, written solely by Elton. Songs that Elton had recorded in Philadelphia in 1977 with legendary soul producers Gamble and Huff were culled down to make a 3-song EP and released as sort of a stopgap while Elton decided his next move. Well, here's an idea. Why not cut loose all of the members of your original band, hook up with Donna Summer's producer, and record a disco album at the exact moment that the genre is about to completely disappear from the top 40 charts? A moment of silence, please. Oh, nah, maybe not. Anyway, Victim of Love, released in 1979, is a disco album. And as you listen to it, should you dare, consider that Elton John did not contribute any original material or any of his piano or keyboard talents to the album. He is featured only as a vocalist, and as nothing beyond a competent vocalist at that. Definitely did not stretch his boundaries on this one. It may come as no surprise then that the album was not commercially or critically well received. Even though the album's title song reached number 31 on the US Billboard Hot 100 chart, Victim of Love was Elton's lowest charting album to date at the time, and it remains the 3rd lowest charting album of his career in the United States. Notable to hear that Elton John has never performed a single song from Victim of Love in concert. Our next little artistic diversion is actually a lot of fun. In 1977, music papers in the UK began featuring ads and articles highlighting the perambulations, basically the comings and goings, of socialite Percy Thrills Thrillington. Who was this mysterious man? Well, whoever he was, an album bearing his name was released that same year, consisting entirely of orchestral and choral arrangements of the songs that had appeared on Paul McCartney's 1971 album Ram. It would be 12 years before the suspected true identity of Percy Thrills Thrillington was actually revealed. In reality, the album had been recorded in June of 1971 with none other than Paul McCartney as its producer. Arranger Richard Anthony Hewson had been asked to work on the orchestration before Ram had even been released. But shortly after Paul and Linda McCartney's Ram album was released, the couple decided to form what would become the band Wings, and this unique orchestral album project was placed on a back burner. When Thrillington was finally released in April of 1977, Paul McCartney's name was mentioned only in the main liner notes, where he's described as a dear friend of Percy's. Thrillington went mostly unnoticed upon its release, although it was reviewed by Rolling Stone magazine. Of course, it was widely assumed that this was McCartney working under a pseudonym, and over the years the album actually became something of a collector's item. Paul McCartney finally came clean and admitted his role in the Thrillington saga to journalist Peter Palmiere during his 1989 world tour, saying, "The world needs to know, but seriously, it was me and Linda, and we kept it a secret for a long time, but now the world knows." He also admitted definitively a year later that he was also Clint Harrigan, the author of Percy Thrillington's album liner notes. McCartney has thankfully revisited Thrillington since then, and he included a remastered version of the entire album in a super deluxe album reissue of Ram that was released in 2012 as part of the Paul McCartney Archive collection. Thrillington is a dynamically diverse record going from gentle and lilting orchestral arrangements to bombastic and exciting flourishes that sometimes verge on cacophonous. Stylistically, it touches on reggae, easy listening, and big band style pop. I promise you that if you enjoy the album Ram or appreciate Paul McCartney's work as a composer with or after the Beatles, you will absolutely love the Thrillington album. Now, my last entry for this episode is probably the most controversial one. In 1982, Neil Young decided to shake things up, He left his longtime record label, Reprise Records, and signed with Geffen Records, the label founded and owned by David Geffen, former manager of Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young. Neil's new contract guaranteed him $1 million per album and gave him total creative control over his recorded output. From late 1980 to mid-1982, Neil Young had spent periods of time every day carrying out a therapy program for his young son Ben, who had been born with cerebral palsy and was unable to speak. Only those closest to Neil at the time knew that the repetitive nature of the exercises that he was performing with Ben had profoundly influenced some of the material on his 1981 album, Reactor. The recording of Neil's next album began, as expected, with Crazy Horse, the band that had played with him on many of his past albums, including Reactor. But Crazy Horse guitarist Pancho Sampedro said that Neil had become increasingly fascinated with two machines that he had acquired, a synclavier and a vocoder. Quote, and the next thing we knew, Neil had stripped all our music off, overdubbed all this stuff, the vocoder, weird sequencing, and put the synth stuff all over it. Neil Young's direction on the 1982 album that would be called Trans was influenced by the electronic experiments of the German band Kraftwerk. A musical collaboration in his 1982 film Human Highway between Neil and the American new wave group Devo, and particularly the group's singing baby character Bougie Boy, also undoubtedly had an influence on Neil Young's approach to trance. Most importantly, however, the distortion of his voice that pervades the album reflected a father's attempts to communicate with his son. Neil Young said, at that time, Ben was simply trying to find a way to talk, to communicate with others. That's what trance is all about. That's why on that record, you know I'm saying something, but you can't understand what it is. Well, that's exactly the same feeling I was getting from my son. Neil Young combined 6 of the synthesizer tracks with 3 tracks that he had recorded in Hawaii for an aborted project called Islands in the Sun to create what he thought would be the final trance album. He proposed making a video to go with the album that would have clarified its meaning, but time and budget restrictions just wouldn't allow that idea to come to fruition. In retrospect, Trans is a striking, powerful album. While aspects of the record and its production are, at this point, somewhat dated, many of the lyrical ideas and the sentiments remain relevant, particularly in our current computer age. And while a track like We Are in Control can get a bit annoying on repeated plays, I will say the album's closing song, Like an Inca, one that is not buried in the synthesizers, is a true Neil Young classic. And some of the synthetic tracks are truly brilliantly recorded, sung, and executed. In a strange plot twist, Trans, along with Neil's next Geffen release, Everybody's Rockin', and the movie Human Highway, would form the basis of a 1983 lawsuit filed against Young by David Geffen on the grounds that he had produced deliberately uncommercial and unrepresentative work. So much for creative control, right? Thanks, David. There are a number of other artists who have made some interesting detours throughout their careers, but their stories will appear in a future episode of Tony T's Toon Talk. I hope that you'll explore some of the music that I've talked about today, and again, be sure to look for it on the excellent digital resources and streaming services that are available through your local library. Thanks for watching. Happy listening.